Fire her. Brandon Merritt said it the way men like him said everything, loudly, to the room, as if the room existed to confirm him. He was 47 years old, CEO of Merritt Capital Partners, worth $890 million on a good quarter, and the black waitress standing at his table had just done the one thing his money had spent 20 years teaching people not to do. She had told him no. His guests, 6 senior partners and 2 institutional investors around the private dining room of the Whitmore Club, went very still in the way people go still when they are deciding whether to intervene or simply survive. The restaurant manager materialized from the far wall, already apologizing, already smoothing the air the way he had learned to smooth it, for members who wrote the checks that kept the lights on. The waitress, Kezia Drummond, 34 years old, 7 weeks into this job, standing with her notepad and her stillness, looked at Brandon Merritt for a beat longer than was safe. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron, not for the notepad, for something smaller, flat, the kind of thing you carry close and don't display unless the moment requires it. She set it on the table in front of him, a federal badge, face up, the seal catching the soft Whitmore Club lighting with the quiet authority of something that did not need to be loud to end a room. Brandon Merritt's smile did not fade. It vanished. The way things vanish when the structure holding them up is suddenly gone. His guests looked at the badge, then at him, then at the waitress, who was no longer, in any meaningful sense, just a waitress. And in the silence that followed, the only sound was the soft click of a recording device in Kezia Drummond's apron pocket, which had been running for 6 weeks. 4 years earlier, the first thing Kezia Drummond learned at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Charlotte field office was that the most effective investigators were the ones who understood invisibility, not as a limitation, but as a tool. Her supervisor, a 22-year veteran named Marcus Teller, had said it plainly on her 3rd day. The agents who solved the cases that mattered were the ones who could stand in a room and have no one notice they were there. Kezia had looked at him across his desk and said, with the particular dry delivery that her colleagues would come to recognize as a signature, "I've been practicing that my whole life." Teller had looked at her for a moment, then he'd said, "Good. Use it." Raised by a mother who was a high school history teacher and a father who ran a small landscaping business that had become over 22 years of early mornings and late autumn cleanups, and the particular discipline of a man who treated every client's lawn as a reflection of his character, a business with 14 employees and a reputation that meant the phone rang before he had to pick it up. Her parents had built something deliberately, in the specific way that black families in the American South build things, with the knowledge that what you create has to be strong enough to survive whether you did not cause. She had inherited that knowledge the way she'd inherited her father's discipline and her mother's love of history, completely, in the bones, before she had language for it. She'd studied criminal justice at UNC Charlotte, then law at Wake Forest, because she had understood early that the law was the most durable architecture available to people who needed protection, and the most dangerous weapon available to people who wished to harm them. And that the difference between those two applications was almost entirely a question of who was doing the practicing. She had clerked for a federal judge for 2 years, not Lorraine Washington, a different judge, though the world Kezia moved through was smaller than it appeared. And it was the judge who had suggested the FBI, not as a consolation prize, as a specific recommendation from a woman who had watched Kezia work for 24 months and understood the particular shape of her gifts. She was recruited at 29, trained at Quantico, assigned to Charlotte's Financial Crimes Unit at 31, which was where she began the slow, meticulous work of learning to look at the architecture of money the way her father looked at the architecture of a lawn, not at the surface, but at what the surface was built on, and whether what was underneath would hold. Brandon Merritt's name first appeared in her case files 18 months before the night at the Whitmore Club. Not as a target, as a name in a network, a node in a financial crimes investigation that was primarily focused on 3 other principles and which had been running for 26 months. Merritt Capital Partners appeared in wire transfer records as a pass-through entity. The appearance was brief, the connection indirect, the kind of thing that might mean nothing or might mean everything depending on what came before it and after it and on either side of it. Kezia had flagged the node. She had put it in a separate file. She had returned to it, at intervals, The way she returned to everything she couldn't immediately resolve, patiently, without forcing it, letting the pattern develop at its own rate. By month 8, the separate file had grown into a case file in its own right. Brandon Merritt, the pattern said, was not a pass-through. He was a hub. Merritt Capital Partners was registered as a private equity firm specializing in distressed asset acquisition. In practice, the practice visible only from inside the financial records that 18 months of investigative work had assembled. It operated as the cleanest money laundering mechanism Kezia's unit had encountered in 4 years of financial crimes work. The distressed assets were real, the acquisitions were real, but threaded through the legitimate business with the particular technical elegance of a scheme designed by someone who understood how investigators worked and had built the operation to be exactly one level of complexity below what triggered automated. Financial surveillance was a secondary structure that moved criminal proceeds through 4 jurisdictions and 3 asset classes before they arrived, clean and documented, in the capital accounts of Merritt's institutional investors. The investors, Kezia's team had concluded, after careful review, were largely unaware. They were receiving returns that were genuinely competitive because the proceeds being laundered were large enough that the real returns subsidized the performance and had no practical mechanism for knowing that their clean returns were underwritten by dirty money. This was part of the architecture. It meant that Merritt had institutional investors with genuine skin in the game, defending the legitimacy of his returns, because their reputation was tied to his, because they'd told their own clients that Merritt Capital was sound. The defense was built into the structure. It was elegant. It was the work of someone who was very good at what he did. Kezia had spent 14 months building the case from the outside. What she needed, and what had eluded her team despite the documentary record they'd assembled, was the mechanism, the specific internal operating procedure by which the secondary structure was managed, the names of the counterparties in the 2 jurisdictions where the money originated, and the communication chain that would tie Merritt personally to the operation, rather than to the legitimate surface of the business. Without the mechanism, the case was strong but not complete. Strong but not complete cases lost. Kezia did not build cases to lose them. The decision to go inside had come after 3 months of discussion with her supervisor and the U.S. Attorney's Office. It required a cover that would place an agent in proximity to Merritt in a setting where he spoke freely, which meant a setting where his power was visible and his guard was down. The Whitmore Club was both. He ate there twice a week. He brought investors and partners. He performed in those rooms the version of himself that did his most useful business, the confident, expansive version, loosened by good wine and the particular security of a man who believed that the people around him would not and could not threaten him. The Whitmore Club had an opening on the service staff. Kezia had applied under a cover identity that her unit had built over 3 months. Work history, references, a social media presence that went back 4 years. She had waited tables before in law school, which meant her cover didn't require her to learn a new skill under pressure, only to perform an existing one in a new context. She'd been hired in 7 days. She had been on the floor of the Whitmore Club for 6 weeks before the night Brandon Merritt snapped at her. Remember this. She had been recording for all 6 of them. The refusal that triggered the evening was not dramatic. Merritt had asked her to remove a dish from the table that a guest had not finished, not because the guest wanted it removed, but because Merritt did. And at the Whitmore Club, his preferences organized the room. Kezia had looked at the guest, who had given the small signal of someone who would prefer to keep their plate, and she had said to Merritt simply and quietly, "The guest hasn't finished, sir. I'll check back in a moment." That was it. That was the entirety of the provocation. What followed was not about the plate. The plate was nothing. The plate was the smallest possible pretext for something that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with the architecture of a room where a man had spent 20 years building a system in which the people who served him understood their role. Kezia had deviated from the system. She had placed a guest's minor preference above his absolute authority. The correction needed to be public because the system was public, because the room needed to know that deviation had a cost. "Fire her," he said, loud, certain, the word already past tense in his delivery, as if the decision had been made before the sentence finished. The manager came, the apologies began, and Kezia Drummond looked at Brandon Merritt, for the beat that she needed, the beat that told her that the recording in her apron pocket was running, that she had what she'd come for 6 weeks ago, and that this particular moment was both the culmination of 14 months of work and the end of the cover that had produced it. She reached into her apron. The badge caught the light. The room went silent in the specific way of people processing a rearrangement of reality that is happening faster than they can track. 6 senior partners, 2 institutional investors, a restaurant manager with his hands still half raised, and Brandon Merritt, who had been performing certainty for so long that its absence looked on his face like something physical had been removed. Kezia set her notepad on the table next to the badge. She looked at Merritt without expression. "Mr. Merritt," she said in the tone of a woman who had been practicing this conversation for 6 weeks, "I'm Special Agent Kezia Drummond, FBI Financial Crimes. I have a warrant for your arrest on federal charges of money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Your attorney has been notified." She paused, not for effect, for the specific purpose of letting every person in the room hear what came next. "I'd also like to inform the gentlemen at this table that they may wish to contact their own counsel before close of business tomorrow. My unit will be in contact." The silence that followed lasted longer than silences usually last. One of the institutional investors, a man who had been at Merritt Capital for 9 years, who had built his own clients' portfolios around Merritt's returns, who had staked a portion of his professional reputation on the legitimacy of this operation, looked at Brandon Merritt with an expression that would have been, in a different context, something like grief. The expression of a man who had trusted a structure and discovered too late what it was built on. Merritt didn't look at him. He looked at Kezia Drummond. The badge, the notepad, the apron she was already untying with the calm efficiency of a woman finishing a job she'd come to complete. His attorney arrived 14 minutes later. By then, 2 additional agents had come through the front entrance of the Whitmore Club, because Kezia had sent the signal the moment the badge had come out of her pocket. The arrest was conducted with the particular quiet of a federal operation that has been planned carefully and has gone according to plan. No drama. No raised voices, just a man being escorted out of the private dining room of a very expensive club, while 6 of his closest business associates watched and understood, with the dawning clarity of people reading the subtext of a room they'd been misreading for years, what they had been participating in. The Whitmore Club's manager, standing at the edge of the room as the agents moved past him, looked at the badge on the table, and then at the doorway through which Brandon Merritt had just been taken, and then at Kezia Drummond, who was folding her apron over the back of a chair with the tidiness of a person who was not coming back. He said nothing. There was nothing really to say. The case went to trial 14 months after the arrest. The U.S. Attorney's Office had the documentation assembled by Kezia's unit, the 6 weeks of recorded conversations at the Whitmore Club, the testimony of 2 Merritt Capital employees who had been aware of the secondary structure and had cooperated with the investigation in exchange for immunity, and the financial records from 4 jurisdictions that traced the flow of criminal proceeds through the asset classes Merritt had used as his mechanism. It was the most comprehensively documented financial crimes case the Charlotte Field Office had brought in 11 years. The defense argued that Merritt had been deceived by subordinates, that the secondary structure had been built without his knowledge or direction, and that the recorded conversations, while damaging in tone, did not constitute evidence of criminal intent. The jury heard 14 days of testimony, deliberated for 3 days, and convicted on all counts. 22 years federal prison. The asset forfeiture proceedings that followed recovered $340 million of the estimated $580 million that had moved through Merritt Capital's secondary structure. A partial recovery because some of what had been moved was beyond recovery, but partial was considerably better than nothing. And the counterparties in 2 jurisdictions who had been named in the evidence were facing their own proceedings in their own courts. The institutional investors, most of them, eventually cooperated with the investigation and were not charged. They had been used. The returns they had received and passed to their own clients were subject to a clawback proceeding that was still running 2 years after the conviction, and the professional consequences for several of the men in that private dining room were significant. And the people who followed these things agreed. Appropriate. Kezia Drummond testified at trial on 3 separate days. She gave her testimony the way she did everything, Precisely, without embellishment, in the measured language of an agent who understood that the work spoke for itself and that the only thing she was required to do was describe it accurately. She was asked by the defense attorney whether her method of investigation, the waitress cover, the 6 weeks, the recording, constituted entrapment. She had answered, without hesitation and without heat, that entrapment required inducement, and that she had induced nothing. She had served food, been told to be fired, and showed a badge. What Brandon Merritt had said and done in the 6 weeks between those two events was entirely his own. The jury had found that convincing. A year after the conviction, Kezia Drummond was working a new case, the nature of which she could not discuss, in a city she declined to name, in a cover that bore no resemblance to any previous one. This was the work. It moved, it changed, it required constant reinvention, and she was suited to it in the bone-deep way that some people are suited to the work they've found. Not because it was easy, because it was exactly hard enough to require everything she was. She called her father on a Sunday, which she did when the work allowed it, because her father had a way of putting things in proportion that no other conversation could. He was at the shop. He was always at the shop on Sundays, doing the bookkeeping he refused to let anyone else handle, because 22 years of building something had made him careful about what he delegated and what he kept. They talked for 40 minutes. He asked about the case. She said she couldn't. He said he knew, which was why he'd asked. Then he said, "You doing the thing your mother's teachers used to say, find the structure and it'll tell you what it's built on." She had not known her mother had told him. It struck her briefly how much she didn't know about the architecture of the people who had built her. "Yes," she said, "that's what I'm doing." "Good," her father said, the same word in the same tone that Lorraine Washington had said to her daughter about a firm's valuation, that Dr. Simmons had said to a student about the work she would do next. The language of parents who raised children who exceeded them and loved them completely for it, and would never find a bigger word than good, because good, said right, contained everything. Kezia sat with the phone after the call was over, in a city she wouldn't name, in a cover she couldn't describe, doing the work that had always been exactly hard enough. She thought about the Whitmore Club, the badge on the white tablecloth, the sound of 6 weeks of recording accumulating in her apron pocket while she refilled water glasses and described the evening specials, and was told, once, to be fired by a man who had no idea what she was holding. She thought about the silence after the badge and the look on the institutional investor's face and the manager who had stood at the edge of the room with nothing to say. She thought about what her supervisor, Marcus Teller, had said on her third day. The agents who solved the cases that mattered were the ones who could stand in a room and have no one notice they were there. She had been practicing that her whole life. It had been enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly the right amount of everything.